I am Harper, 35, at my grandfather's will reading my family celebrated like it was a victory parade. They cheered as my sister inherited millions. When the lawyer handed me a yellowed envelope, my white brother-in-law tossed $100 bill at me, calling it charity for the family failure. I just smiled and walked out. They had no idea that inside was a phone number that would obliterate their new fortune. Before I explain how I dismantled their fake empire, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that underestimated your worth. The Atlanta conference room smelled of expensive leather and greed. My parents, Corinne and Harrison, sat on the edge of their chairs, eyes darting toward the lawyer. Next to them sat my sister, Vanessa, adjusting her designer dress. Beside her was Preston, her husband, a hedge fund manager, whose presence in our African-American family came with a thick layer of unearned superiority. The lawyer cleared his throat. To my eldest granddaughter, Vanessa, I leave $5 million and full ownership of the 3 laundromat properties in the South District. Vanessa gasped, pulling Preston into a hug. $5 million, she squealed, looking at me with a familiar smirk. We can finally upgrade the summer house, babe. Preston leaned back with a satisfied grin. He looked at me, his blue eyes dripping with condescension. Looks like the old man knew who understands money in this family. My mother, Corinne, nodded. Absolutely. Vanessa and Preston bought him that top-of-the-line ventilator. They earned this. The wealth goes to the ones who create value. I sat still. I did not mention the ventilator was paid for using a credit card they opened in my grandfather's name. I did not mention the countless nights I spent feeding him while they attended galas. I chose a career as an urban real estate strategist focusing on affordable housing. To my parents who worshipped high society status, my career was an embarrassing charity project. And to my granddaughter Harper, the lawyer continued, I leave this envelope. He slid a yellowed envelope across the table. It stopped in front of me. The room went silent before Vanessa burst into laughter. An envelope, Vanessa cackled. What is in there, Harper? Coupons for your community projects? Preston chuckled, reaching into his suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and tossed it across the table. It fluttered down, landing on my yellowed envelope. Take it, little sis, Preston said with a patronizing smile. An urban planner for the poor probably will not cover rent this month. Consider it white savior charity. My father, Harrison, laughed. Now, Preston, do not be cruel. Harper chose her path. We told her that trying to save the neighborhood would not pay the bills. She wanted to be a martyr for the community, and now she gets to live like one. I looked at the $100 bill resting on my grandfather's final gift to me. The sheer disrespect was suffocating, yet I felt a strange sense of calm washing over me. They were acting exactly as my grandfather had predicted. He always said wealth was a mirror that revealed a person's true face. Today, their faces were distorted by greed and arrogance. You should say thank you to Preston, my mother scolded. He is being generous. You could learn a lot from him and your sister about how the real world operates. I did not touch the money. Instead, I calmly picked up the yellowed envelope. The paper was fragile, smelling faintly of the peppermint tobacco my grandfather always chewed. I slid my fingernail under the wax seal and opened it. There was no check inside. There was no deed. There was no legal document outlining a trust or a bank account. There was only a solid black matte business card. It had no company name, no logo, and no email address. Printed in bold white font was a single phone number. On the back, in my grandfather's unmistakable shaky handwriting, was a short message. For the only wolf in the family. I stared at the words. A wolf. That was what he used to call me when I was a little girl, fiercely protective of my territory, refusing to back down from fights I knew were right, even when I was outnumbered. Well, Vanessa sneered, stretching her neck to get a look. Is it a map to a hidden treasure chest, or just a sweet note telling you he loves your terrible career choices? I stood up, pushing my heavy chair backward. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, cutting off Preston's impending laugh. I left the $100 bill sitting on the table right where Preston had thrown it. Keep your charity, Preston, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and cold. You are going to need it to pay your own legal fees very soon. I turned and walked out of the conference room, ignoring the chorus of insults my parents hurled at my back. My mother shouted that I was bitter. My father yelled that I was a disgrace. I let the heavy oak door swing shut behind me, cutting off their toxic voices. The hallway of the law firm was quiet, lined with large windows overlooking the busy Atlanta streets. My heart pounded against my ribs as I pulled my cell phone from my purse. I looked at the black card one more time, memorizing the digits before punching them into my keypad. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear. It rang exactly one time before the line clicked open. There was a brief silence thick with anticipation. Then a deep, strangely familiar, and highly resonant voice spoke quietly through the receiver. I have been waiting for this exact call for a very long time, my heir. He gave me an address and hung up before I could ask a single question. An hour later, I stood in front of a sleek glass building in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The address the mysterious voice had given me belonged to one of the most exclusive private wealth management firms in the state. I walked through the revolving doors, my sensible work heels clicking softly against the imported marble floor. The receptionist did not ask for my name. She simply looked at the black business card in my hand and immediately escorted me to a private elevator. It took me to the top floor, where the doors opened into a massive corner office overlooking the entire city skyline. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window was an older African-American man in a tailored charcoal suit. He turned as I entered, and the sheer authority in his posture commanded instant respect. He walked toward me, extending his hand. "I am Elias Thorne," he said, his deep, resonant voice filling the room. "Your grandfather and I built many things together, Harper. Things your family knows absolutely nothing about. Please sit." I took a seat in the leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. My mind was racing. My family had just spent the morning celebrating what they thought was my grandfather's entire legacy. Vanessa was probably out shopping for a new sports car right now, using the projected income from those 3 laundromats. What could possibly be left? Elias opened a heavy steel safe behind his desk and pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio. He placed it directly in front of me. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man." Elias began, leaning forward and resting his hands on the desk. "He let your parents and your sister believe he was just a modest business owner. He let them mock his frugality. He let them think those 3 laundromats were his crowning achievement. But your grandfather understood real estate better than anyone I have ever met. He knew the value of dirt." I looked down at the portfolio. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elias tapped the leather cover. "Your sister Vanessa inherited the operational businesses of those 3 laundromats. She owns the washing machines, the coin dispensers, and the daily revenue, but she does not own the land beneath them. Your grandfather placed the deeds to that land into a covert land trust decades ago. And he did not stop there. Over the last 40 years, every time a commercial building on that strip went up for sale, he bought it through anonymous shell companies." He opened the portfolio, revealing a map of the South District. A massive red border outlined the laundromats and stretched across 6 entire commercial blocks. My breath caught in my throat. This was the very district I had been trying to protect from aggressive corporate gentrification. It was the cultural heartbeat of the city. "The laundromats are just a front," Elias continued. "The land beneath them and those 6 adjacent blocks belong to Vanguard Holdings. It is a private land trust currently valued at over $150 million. And as of this morning, you are the sole controlling beneficiary." The room spun. $150 million. I stared at the map. The scale of it was staggering. My grandfather had essentially owned a significant portion of Atlanta. He had held this massive empire in secret, watching his children and grandchildren obsess over designer labels and country club memberships. He watched them worship Preston for his flashy hedge fund money while sitting on a fortune that dwarfed Preston's entire portfolio. "Why me?" I asked, my hands trembling as I touched the documents. Why did he not tell anyone? "Because he saw them for who they really are," Elias said, his voice hardening with disdain. "He saw their greed. He saw how quickly they would sell out their own community for a quick payout from developers. And he saw you, Harper. He watched you study urban planning. He watched you fight for affordable housing. He watched you endure their insults and their mockery at every family dinner. He knew you would protect the land. He knew you would not be blinded by the money. He told me you were the only wolf in a family of sheep. A wolf. The word echoed in my mind again. A wolf protects its territory. A wolf defends its pack. My grandfather had not left me a simple inheritance. He had handed me a weapon. He had handed me a crown. The years of biting my tongue while Preston made his racist remarks. The years of smiling through my mother's harsh criticisms. The years of watching my sister parade her golden child status in my face. All of it had been a test. And I had passed. I looked at the deed documents. My name was printed clearly on the controlling shares. I traced the letters with my finger. I felt a surge of power I had never experienced before. It was not the power to destroy, but the power to protect. The power to finally stand up and command the respect they had denied me my entire life. "We need to finalize the transfer of control," Elias said, pulling out a silver pen. "Once you sign these documents, you will have absolute authority over the trust. No property can be sold, modified, or demolished without your explicit legal consent." I reached for the pen, but before my fingers could grasp the cool metal, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my purse. The loud buzzing shattered the quiet dignity of the office. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The caller identification flashed the word "mother." I had just left her screaming insults at me less than 2 hours ago. She'd called me a disgrace. She had watched Preston throw money at me and laughed. There was absolutely no reason for her to be calling me right now unless she wanted to deliver another round of verbal abuse. I swiped the screen and answered, holding the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. "Harper, get back to the house right this second," my mother barked, her voice shrill and frantic. The background noise was chaotic. I could hear my father yelling instructions and the sound of popping champagne corks. "I am busy, mother," I replied, my tone icy and detached. "What do you want?" "Do not take that tone with me," she snapped. "Preston just finalized a massive deal. He has secured investors to build a mega mall right over the South District. It is going to make us hundreds of millions. The whole family is pulling our resources together. Your father and I are putting up the family estate as collateral to secure the final bank loans. We are going to be untouchable." My grip on the phone tightened. A mega mall. Over the South District. Preston was planning to bulldoze the community. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Preston's lawyers just reviewed your grandfather's paperwork," my mother said, her impatience bleeding through the speaker. "Since Vanessa inherited the laundromat businesses, the bank needs all remaining family members to sign a standard liability waiver. It is just a formality to release any residual family claims to the old properties, so Preston can bring in the demolition crews next week. Get over here and sign the waiver right now so we can celebrate properly. Do not ruin this for your sister Harper." I looked up from the phone and met Elias Thorne's gaze. He raised an eyebrow, silently questioning what was happening. I looked down at the map of the $150 million land trust sitting on the desk. My land. Preston wanted to demolish my land. He wanted my parents to mortgage their entire lives to fund a project on land he did not even own. He was selling them a ghost. He was selling them a lie. "I will be right there, Mother," I said. A slow smile spread across my face. "I will not ruin anything for my sister. I will make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve." The drive to my parents' estate in Buckhead took exactly 40 minutes. I used every second of that drive to lock my emotions into a tight box. I parked my modest sedan between Vanessa's brand-new luxury convertible and Preston's imported sports car. The front door was unlocked, and the sound of clinking glasses and loud laughter echoed through the grand foyer. My parents had wasted no time. The caterers were already packing up trays of lobster and caviar in the kitchen. I found my family gathered in the formal living room. My mother, Corinne, was holding a crystal flute of champagne and examining a brochure for a luxury cruise. My father, Harrison, was swirling whiskey in his glass while listening to Preston brag about zoning permits. Vanessa sat on the velvet sofa flipping through her phone. When I walked into the room, the conversation stopped abruptly. My mother sighed heavily and set her glass down. "You took your time, Harper," my mother said. "Preston has investors waiting, and we cannot let a simple clerical error delay a $50 million project." Preston did not even bother to stand up. He reached into his leather briefcase on the coffee table and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed a silver pen on top of the papers and pushed them toward the edge of the table. "Just sign on the dotted lines, little sis," Preston said with a lazy smile. "It is a standard quitclaim deed and liability waiver. The bank just needs to make sure no estranged family members come crawling out of the woodwork to claim a piece of the pie once the mega mall breaks ground." I walked over to the table and picked up the documents. I did not look at the signature page. I went straight to the fine print in the asset description. There it was. Vanguard Holdings. They were trying to get me to legally sign away my rights to the covert land trust my grandfather had built. They assumed I was too stupid or too naive to read the details. They thought I still believed the envelope contained nothing. "I am not signing this," I said quietly, dropping the papers back onto the table. Vanessa rolled her eyes and tossed her phone aside. "Are you seriously doing this right now, Harper? Do you always have to play the victim? Grandpa left you out of the money because you refuse to live in the real world. Stop throwing a tantrum and sign the paper so my husband can get to work." I looked directly at my sister. "The real world is built on ownership, Vanessa, not on riding your husband's coattails. I am not signing away my rights to a property I know nothing about." My father slammed his whiskey glass down on the side table so hard the crystal nearly shattered. The sound made the room go completely still. He marched across the Persian rug until he was standing inches from my face. His eyes were dark with a rage I had seen many times before, usually when I refused to conform to his rigid expectations of how a daughter should behave. "You are going to pick up that pen, and you are going to sign that document," Harrison demanded. "You have been a disappointment to this family since the day you chose to waste your education on community projects instead of corporate law. Preston is giving us a chance to multiply our wealth, and I will not let your petty jealousy ruin it." "My jealousy?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You are mortgaging the house you live in to fund a project managed by a man who openly mocks you. You are gambling everything on Preston." The slap echoed through the large room. My father struck me across the face with the back of his hand. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side, and a sharp, stinging pain radiated across my cheek. I tasted copper in my mouth where my teeth had caught my inner lip. I did not fall, and I did not raise my hand to touch my face. I just slowly turned my head back to look at him. "You are no daughter of mine," my father spat. "You are a bitter, ungrateful failure. Get out of my house." My mother did not gasp. She did not rush to comfort me. She simply picked up her champagne flute and took a delicate sip. "You brought this on yourself, Harper," she said coldly. "We gave you every opportunity to be part of this family, and you threw it back in our faces." Preston stood up, straightening his expensive suit jacket. He pulled his phone from his pocket and looked at me with pure malice. "You want to play hardball, Harper? Let us play. You still use that checking account I set up for you at my bank, right? The one linked to your business expenses. And you are still on the family corporate health insurance plan because your little community planning firm cannot afford premium coverage." He dialed a number on his phone and put it on speaker for everyone to hear. A customer service representative answered immediately. Preston gave his executive authorization code. "Yes, I need to freeze an auxiliary account immediately and terminate a dependent health insurance policy," he said, staring right into my eyes. "Effective right now." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Good luck paying your rent this month, little sis," Preston sneered. "Good luck paying for those therapy sessions you need so much. You have nothing. You are nothing. Now get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." I looked at the 4 people in the room. They looked back at me with unified disgust. There was no love here, and there never had been. They had drawn their battle lines, and they had chosen their king. I turned around and walked out of the front door, stepping into the freezing night air. The heavy mahogany door slammed shut behind me, locking me out of my family forever. The winter wind bit through my thin coat as I walked to my car. I got into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My cheek was throbbing and my bank accounts were frozen, but my mind had never been clearer. I reached into the passenger seat and opened my laptop. I brought up the mega mall blueprints Preston had proudly posted on his company website earlier that day. I stared at the massive structure designed to pave over 6 blocks of prime real estate. Preston planned to bulldoze the neighborhood starting next week. He had the investors lined up and the bank loans ready. But as I looked at the property lines, a chilling realization washed over me. Preston had just tried to get me to sign a waiver for Vanguard Holdings. That meant he knew the land was tied up in the trust. But if I was the sole controlling beneficiary and I had never signed a deed of sale, how could he possibly prove to the bank that he owned the land? How could he buy the dirt when the true owner never gave him a signature? I wiped a drop of blood from my lip and smiled in the dark car. Someone had forged my grandfather's name. I drove straight to a 24-hour coffee shop and sat in the back booth with my laptop open until the sun came up. I was locked out of my checking account, but I still had my emergency credit card. I ordered black coffee and started digging into the county property registry. By the time I walked back into Elias Thorne's office at 8 in the morning, I had a headache and a theory. Elias was already at his desk reviewing a stack of files. He looked up as I entered and noticed the faint red mark on my cheek where my father had hit me. He did not ask about it. He just poured me a cup of tea and waited for me to speak. Preston filed a deed of sale for the South District properties 2 weeks before my grandfather died, I said, taking a seat. I saw it on the county tax assessor website. He transferred the surface titles to a shell company called Apex Development. But my grandfather was in a medically induced coma during that time. He could not have signed anything. Elias turned to his computer and typed rapidly. A few seconds later, he turned the monitor toward me. He pulled up a scanned copy of the property transfer document. "Look at the signature," Elias said, pointing to the bottom of the page. I leaned in closely. The handwriting was shaky, trying to mimic the tremor my grandfather developed in his later years. But the loops on the letters were entirely wrong. My grandfather always crossed his letter T with a sharp, downward angle. This line was perfectly straight. It was a forgery, but it was a very specific one. I had seen someone practice that exact signature before. "Vanessa," I said, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. She used to sign his checks to pay the landscapers when his arthritis flared up. She knows exactly how to fake his handwriting. Elias tapped the screen, bringing up another document attached to the deed. "And this is how they bypassed the notary requirement," he explained. "They attached a medical power of attorney granting Vanessa full financial control over his assets." I stared at the document in disbelief. The date on the power of attorney was from 5 years ago. I remembered that day clearly. My grandfather was having a minor knee surgery, and Vanessa had convinced him to sign a temporary medical proxy just in case there were complications. He revoked it the moment he was discharged. "They kept a copy," I said, my voice tight with anger. "They took a revoked 5-year-old medical proxy, altered the dates, and used it to grant Vanessa the authority to sign away his properties." "Exactly," Elias said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Vanessa forged his signature on a fraudulent sale agreement, transferring the properties to Preston's shell company. But here is the brilliant part. Preston did not actually pay for the land. He short-sold it to himself for pennies on the dollar to avoid raising red flags with the IRS. He is using the land as collateral to secure a $50 million construction loan from the bank." "It is money laundering," I said, realizing the full scope of my brother-in-law's scheme. "Preston's hedge fund has been losing money for months. I read the industry rumors. He is using my grandfather's land to secure clean bank money to cover his bad investments. He plans to bulldoze the neighborhood, build his mega mall, and flip it to a corporate buyer before anyone notices the initial paperwork was faked." "He is arrogant," Elias agreed. "He assumed that because your grandfather lived modestly, the properties were just outdated commercial lots, without any underlying trust protections. He does not know about Vanguard Holdings. He does not know that the surface deeds he forged are completely worthless, because the land itself is locked in an irrevocable trust controlled entirely by you. My family committed federal wire fraud and forgery, I said, letting the reality wash over me. My own parents are putting up their house as collateral to back a fraudulent loan. They are so desperate for prestige and proximity to whiteness that they willingly sold out their own blood. Elias looked at me with a steady, calculating gaze. As the controlling beneficiary of Vanguard Holdings, you have the power to void this entire transaction right now, Harper. I can file an injunction by noon. We can freeze Preston's company and have him investigated for fraud before the day is over. I looked down at the forged signature on the screen. I thought about the sting of my father's hand against my cheek. I thought about my mother raising her champagne glass to toast my failure. I thought about Preston calling me a broke black girl and freezing my bank account just to watch me suffer. If we stop him now, he will just hire expensive lawyers and claim it was a misunderstanding, I said quietly. My family will play the victims. They will say I am a jealous sister trying to ruin their success. They need to believe they have won Elias. They need to sign the bank loans. They need to put their own house on the line. I want them to build their house of cards as high as possible before I kick out the foundation. You want to let them commit the federal crime completely? Elias asked, a slow smile appearing on his face. I want them to dig their own graves, I replied. Do not file the injunction yet. Let Preston think he owns the land. Before Elias could respond, my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a call from an unknown number. I answered it cautiously. Harper, is that you? A woman asked, her voice shaking with panic. Yes, this is Harper, I said, recognizing the voice. It was Mrs. Jackson, the owner of a small bakery that had been operating in the South District for 3 generations. My grandfather used to buy peach cobbler from her every Sunday. Harper, you have to help us, Mrs. Jackson cried. There are men here in suits accompanied by private security guards. They are taping notices to our doors. They are telling us we have to vacate the premises. What kind of notices? I asked, standing up from my chair. Eviction notices, she sobbed. 30-day eviction notices. They said the block has been sold to Apex Development and the buildings are scheduled for demolition next month. Harper, there are 50 small businesses here. This is our livelihood. This is our community. They are telling us we are trespassing on private property. I felt my blood turn to ice. Preston was not waiting for the bank loan to clear. He was moving in for the kill. He was using his fake authority to terrorize 50 black-owned businesses, forcing them out before they could organize any legal defense. He wanted to crush the legacy of our community and sweep the rubble away before anyone even knew what hit them. Do not pack a single box, Mrs. Jackson, I said, my voice turning lethal. I am on my way. I drove straight to the South District and found Mrs. Jackson standing on the sidewalk with tears in her eyes. Several other business owners were gathered around her, looking at the neon green eviction notices plastered on their windows. I walked up to Mrs. Jackson and tore the paper right off her glass door. I told her and everyone else on the street to go back to work. I promised them that no bulldozers would ever touch this block. I called Elias from my car and told him we were not waiting anymore. We needed to dismantle Preston immediately before he could cause any more panic. Elias had spent the morning digging through the financial records of Apex Development. What he found was worse than we thought. Preston was not just using my grandfather's land to secure a bank loan. He was using it to cover massive black market credit card debt. He owed millions to offshore lenders, and they were threatening to liquidate his entire hedge fund if he did not pay up by the end of the month. He was desperate. Elias smiled and asked if I wanted to make an investment. Using the massive capital reserves of Vanguard Holdings, I authorized Elias to buy out every single cent of Preston's offshore debt. It took less than an hour to process the transfers. I was no longer just the owner of the land Preston was trying to steal. I was now his sole creditor. I owned him. I knew exactly where my family would be celebrating their imaginary victory. The Oakwood Country Club was an ultra-exclusive members-only establishment on the north side of the city. My parents spent half their annual income on membership fees just to rub shoulders with the old money elite and pretend they were part of high society. I drove up the winding tree-lined driveway and parked my sensible sedan between two luxury vehicles. I walked past the valet and straight through the heavy oak double doors of the clubhouse. I did not stop at the front desk. I strode directly into the main dining room where crystal chandeliers hung over tables covered in white linen. I spotted them immediately in the center of the room. My father was holding a glass of scotch, talking loudly to a group of wealthy investors. My mother was laughing at something Vanessa said while Preston sat back looking like a king observing his court. I walked right up to their table and picked up a full glass of red wine that was sitting untouched next to Preston. My mother gasped loudly, dropping her fork onto her china plate. "Harper, what on earth are you doing here?" my mother hissed, looking around nervously to see if anyone was watching us. "This is a private club. You are going to embarrass us." My father stepped forward, his face flushing red with anger. "I told you to get out of my life," Harrison said, his voice trembling with rage. "You have no right to show your face here after what you pulled last night. Security is going to drag you out of here in handcuffs." Preston leaned back in his chair and let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He snapped his fingers and pointed at me. Two burly white security guards immediately began walking toward our table. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Preston said to the guards with a condescending smirk. "It seems a broke black girl has wandered off the street and gotten lost in our dining room. She does not belong here. Please escort her to the exit and call the police if she resists." Vanessa giggled and took a sip of her water. "You really should have stayed in your little low-income neighborhood, Harper," she sneered. "You are completely out of your depth." The two security guards reached our table. One of them put his heavy hand on my arm and told me it was time to leave. I did not flinch. I did not even look at the guard. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Preston. I held the glass of red wine up to the light swirling the dark crimson liquid. I could see Preston waiting for me to lose my temper. He wanted me to throw the wine in his face. He wanted me to act like the angry, bitter woman he always claimed I was, so he could have me arrested for assault in front of all his wealthy friends. I smiled and took a slow sip of the wine instead. "I am not going anywhere," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. "And neither are you, Preston. Not until you explain to these lovely investors how you plan to build a mega mall on land you do not own." Preston scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Do not listen to her," he told the investors at the table. "She is just a jealous sister who got cut out of the family will. I have the signed deeds to the South District properties right here in my briefcase. You have forged surface deeds signed with a revoked 5-year-old medical proxy." I corrected him loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "The land beneath those buildings belongs to Vanguard Holdings, an irrevocable trust created by my grandfather. And as the sole controlling beneficiary of that trust, I am telling you that you will never touch a single grain of dirt in the South District." The color completely drained from Preston's face. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure terror. My father looked confused, looking back and forth between me and Preston. "What is she talking about, Preston?" my father demanded. "Tell me she is lying." I did not give Preston a chance to speak. I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick stack of financial documents. I dropped them directly onto Preston's lap. "I know about your offshore accounts, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I know about the millions you owe to black market lenders because your hedge fund is a complete fraud. But the worst news for you today is that Vanguard Holdings just bought out every single one of those debts. I am your new creditor. I own your house. I own your cars. I own your fake little hedge fund." I set the half-empty glass of wine down on the table right in front of him. "I would throw this wine in your face, brother-in-law," I said with a cold smile. "But you do not even have enough credit left to pay for the dry cleaning bill." The entire dining room went dead silent. The security guard slowly removed his hand from my arm, backing away as he realized the dynamic of power had just violently shifted. Preston sat frozen in his chair, staring at the financial documents in his lap, like they were covered in poison. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, and a bead of sweat rolled down his forehead. Vanessa looked at the papers and then up at her husband, her eyes wide with panic. Preston, tell me this is a joke, Vanessa pleaded, grabbing his arm. Tell her she is crazy. Preston could not speak. He just stared at me, his blue eyes finally showing the absolute defeat he deserved. I turned to my parents, who were standing frozen in shock as they watched their golden son-in-law completely disintegrate in front of the entire country club. They had bet their entire family estate on a man who was nothing but a broke fraud, and now they were going to lose everything. Enjoy your lunch, I said to my family. The bill is entirely on you. I turned my back on their stunned faces and walked out of the country club dining room. The silence I left behind was heavier than any argument we had ever had. For the first time in my life, I did not feel the crushing weight of their disapproval or the sting of my father's violence. I felt absolute pure freedom. I handed the valet my ticket and drove away from the Oakwood Country Club, leaving my family to deal with the ashes of their fake empire and a lunch bill they could no longer afford. Over the next few days, Elias helped me transition into my new reality. Vanguard Holdings was a vast machine, and managing it required a secure base of operations. I officially moved out of my small apartment and into a multi-million-dollar penthouse in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. It spanned the entire top floor of a high-rise building featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, a private elevator, and a security system that rivaled a federal bank. It was a fortress in the sky. I bought it entirely in cash, using a fraction of the trust liquid assets. I needed a place where my family could not simply kick in the door and demand my compliance. Elias had warned me that desperate people do desperate things. He advised me to cut all contact, but a part of me knew that my family would not simply walk away from a fortune this massive. They had built their entire identities on the illusion of wealth and supremacy. Taking that away from them meant war, and I was fully prepared to fight it. On Thursday afternoon, I was standing in my massive new kitchen, unpacking a box of my grandfather's favorite books, when the private elevator chime echoed softly through the penthouse. My security panel flashed, showing a live video feed from the lobby. It was my mother. Corinne stood there wearing her signature pearl necklace and holding a small designer gift bag. She was looking nervously at the marble walls of the lobby, her usual arrogant posture replaced by something that looked entirely like desperation. I hesitated. I had explicitly told Elias and the building security to block all access to my family. But a part of me wanted to know what she was playing at. How far was she willing to degrade herself to get what she wanted? I pressed the button on the intercom to grant her elevator access. The heavy metal doors slid open directly into my foyer. My mother stepped out and her eyes went wide. She took in the imported hardwood floors, the modern art on the walls, and the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. She clearly had no idea I actually owned the place. I could see her mind spinning, trying to rationalize it. She was probably assuming I was renting it using a line of credit, or that Elias had temporarily put me up here to keep me quiet while the lawyers worked things out. Harper. Darling, my mother said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. She walked toward me, holding out the gift bag with a trembling hand. I brought you some of those imported tea blends you used to like. I know things have been so difficult lately, and I just wanted to check on my little girl. I did not take the bag. I just stared at her. My cheek still bore a faint yellow bruise from where my father had struck me just days prior. She had sipped champagne while he did it. Now she was standing in my home pretending to be a concerned parent. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Please, Harper, she continued, letting a perfectly timed tear slip down her carefully made-up cheek. Your father and Preston have completely lost their minds. The stress of the business is tearing this family apart, and I cannot bear to lose you. I know we have made mistakes, but I am your mother. I just want us to be a family again. I want to understand what your grandfather really left you so we can fix this horrible mess together. Preston is talking about bankruptcy, Harper. We could lose the family estate. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was fishing for information. Preston was backed into a corner, and they desperately needed to know how to access the Vanguard Trust. They sent her to play the sympathetic mother to lower my defenses. I decided to test her. "That is very kind of you, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and unreadable. "Let me go to the kitchen and brew some of this tea. Make yourself comfortable in the living room." I set my leather handbag down on the glass coffee table, right next to where she was sitting. I walked into the kitchen, but I did not go to the stove. I stood perfectly still behind the marble island, watching her reflection in the dark tinted glass of the wine fridge. The moment she thought I was out of sight, her tearful, concerned mother act vanished instantly. Her posture straightened, and her eyes darted toward the hallway to ensure I was gone. Then she lunged for my handbag. I watched in cold, absolute fascination as she frantically dug her perfectly manicured hands into my purse. She tossed my wallet and my keys aside, caring only about finding one thing. She was looking for the yellowed envelope. She was looking for the black business card or any bank documents she could find. She assumed I carried bank access codes or account numbers that could somehow save Preston's crumbling hedge fund. She was muttering under her breath, her hands shaking with greed and panic as she rifled through my personal belongings. I stepped out from the kitchen, my footsteps silent on the thick rug. I watched her pull out a small leather notebook and flip through the pages, her breathing ragged. "Looking for something specific, Mother?" I asked loudly. She jumped violently, dropping the notebook onto the hardwood floor. She spun around, her face flushing a deep, guilty red. "Harper," she stammered, taking a quick step back from the coffee table. "I was just looking for a tissue. My allergies are acting up." "Do not insult my intelligence," I said, walking over and picking up my notebook. "You came here to steal from me. You came here hoping to find a way to hack into Vanguard Holdings to save your precious son-in-law. You thought you could cry a few fake tears, and I would just hand over the keys to the kingdom." Her face hardened, the panicked embarrassment dissolving into raw, vicious anger. The mask completely fell away, revealing the toxic woman who had always viewed me as a threat to her social status. "You do not deserve a single penny of that money, Harper," my mother screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "That trust belongs to this family. It belongs to people who know how to manage wealth and build a legacy. You are nothing but a naive community organizer playing dress-up in a fancy apartment. You stole your sister's inheritance. You manipulated a dying old man to bypass the real heirs. You are a disgrace to the family name, and we will drag you through court until you have nothing left." I listened to her scream, and I felt absolutely nothing. No heartbreak, no disappointment, just a cold, absolute certainty that my grandfather had been right about every single one of them. I walked over to the private elevator and pressed the call button. The doors slid open with a soft chime. "I am not the one begging for money in someone else's home," I said, pointing toward the open elevator doors. "Get out of my penthouse, Mother." My mother snatched her purse, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She stepped into the elevator, her fists clenched at her sides. "This is not over, Harper," she spat as the doors began to close. "We will crush you." I smiled as the gap narrowed, leaving her to face the reality of her collapsing world. "I know," I said softly. "The game has just begun." I did not sleep at all that night. I sat at the massive marble island in my new kitchen, staring at the digital files Elias had sent over to my laptop. Preston was moving much faster than we had anticipated. His offshore creditors were closing in on him, and he desperately needed to secure that $50 million construction loan by the end of the business day. He had chosen Sterling National Bank for the transaction. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious financial institutions in the entire state. It was where the old money of the city kept their vaults, and where multi-million-dollar development deals were quietly rubber-stamped over cigars and expensive coffee. Preston was going there to finalize the loan using my grandfather's land as collateral. What my family did not know was the true depth of Vanguard Holdings. My grandfather had not just collected real estate, he was a silent predator in the financial markets. 30 years ago, when Sterling National was on the brink of collapse during a severe recession, my grandfather had quietly injected enough capital to save them. In exchange, he acquired a massive block of anonymous voting shares. I was not just a wealthy client. I was the second largest shareholder of the very bank Preston was walking into. I dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit and met Elias in the lobby of my building. We drove to the financial district in silence. We did not use the main entrance of the bank. Elias had already spoken to Arthur Sterling, the chairman of the board, and one of the few men who knew my grandfather's true legacy. A private security guard escorted us through the underground parking garage and up a secure elevator directly to the top floor. Arthur Sterling was waiting for us in his private office. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He poured me a cup of black coffee and pointed to a set of heavy oak doors on the far side of his office. Those doors led directly into the primary executive conference room, the room where my family was currently sitting. Arthur pressed a button on his desk and a hidden speaker system hummed to life. We could hear every word being spoken in the adjacent room. My father was holding court. His voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with unearned arrogance. "This mega mall is exactly what the South District needs," Harrison was saying. "We are taking a blighted, useless neighborhood and injecting it with real capital. We are doing the city a favor. It takes a certain kind of vision to see the potential in that kind of squalor." Preston chimed in, his tone smooth and overly confident. "The land has been sitting there rotting for decades," he said. "My late grandfather-in-law meant well, but he was incredibly old-fashioned. He lacked the aggressive modern instincts required to maximize asset value. Thankfully, I have the experience to modernize the portfolio. I have the signed deeds and the environmental clearances right here in my briefcase." I listened as the bank president, a man named Richard Vance, spoke up. "Everything looks to be in perfect order, Preston," he said. "The collateral of the family estate covers the required margins, and the medical power of attorney, giving your wife financial control, has been verified by our legal team. We are thrilled to partner with Apex Development on this project." I heard my mother let out a soft, elegant laugh. "We are just so relieved to finally get this project moving," Corinne said. "The family has been under so much stress lately. My eldest daughter has been struggling with some severe mental health issues, and it has been quite a burden on us all. We really need a positive victory today." My blood ran cold. She was already spinning the narrative. She was planting the seed that I was unstable just in case I tried to make a scene. They had thought of everything. "Let me just input my executive code to release the $50 million funds to your corporate account," Richard Vance said. I heard the sharp clicking of a mechanical keyboard. The room fell into an expectant, breathless silence. My family was seconds away from stealing $50 million. Then a sudden loud electronic blare filled the room. It was a harsh, aggressive warning tone that echoed through the speakers. "Wait," Richard Vance said, his voice dropping in absolute confusion. "That cannot be right. The system just flagged a hard stop. It says the entire transaction is permanently locked by a senior shareholder override." "What do you mean locked?" Preston demanded. I could hear his chair scrape violently against the hardwood floor as he stood up. "I pre-approved this entire transfer with your loan department yesterday afternoon. This is a $50 million deal. You cannot just lock it out of nowhere. There must be a glitch in your system. Fix it right now." I looked at Elias and Arthur. Arthur gave me a slow, respectful nod. It was time. I walked over to the heavy oak doors and pushed them open. The heavy thud of my heels against the polished floor made everyone turn around instantly, the color completely drained from the room. My mother gasped loudly, dropping her designer handbag. The contents spilled across the carpet, but she did not even look down. Vanessa put a trembling hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. My father took a step back, his face turning pale with shock. "The transaction is locked because I vetoed it," I said, keeping my voice perfectly cold and steady. I walked to the head of the conference table and stood right next to the bank president. "What in the hell are you doing here, Harper?" my father yelled, slamming his hand down on the table. "You are trespassing in a private executive meeting." He looked wildly at the bank president. "Security needs to remove her immediately. She has been stalking us. She is mentally unwell." Richard Vance looked at my father and then looked up at Elias, who had stepped into the room behind me. "Mr. Wilson." "I am afraid I cannot do that," Richard Vance said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is Elias Thorne representing Vanguard Holdings. and this young woman is their controlling beneficiary. Vanguard Holdings is the second largest anonymous shareholder of Sterling National Bank. She has the executive authority to freeze any commercial loan in this building. The room went dead silent. The smug expression on Preston's face shattered into a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. He stared at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. My mother sank back into her chair, clutching her chest as she struggled to breathe. The illusion of their power was evaporating right in front of their eyes. "You really thought you could walk into my bank and use my land to secure your fraudulent loan?" I asked Preston. I picked up the forged deeds resting on the conference table and handed them directly to Richard Vance. "Take a good look at that medical power of attorney he is using to claim ownership of the South District," I told the bank president. "It was completely revoked 5 years ago. Preston and my sister forged my grandfather's signature to steal $150 million worth of real estate. They are attempting to commit federal bank fraud right in front of you." Richard Vance snatched his hands away from the papers like they were covered in acid. Preston lunged forward, trying to grab the documents back, but Elias stepped smoothly in his way, blocking him completely. "You are out of your mind!" Preston screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life? I built this deal from the ground up. You are nothing but a bitter little girl playing with money you do not even understand." He slammed both of his fists down on the heavy mahogany table, leaning toward me with a look of pure feral hatred. The veins in his neck were bulging and spit flew from his mouth as he lost all control. "I am going to destroy you, Harper," he snarled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I am going to call every media contact I have. I am going to go on every podcast and news station in this city and expose you. I will tell the whole world exactly how you abused a dying old man to steal your family's fortune. You want a war. I will make sure your name is absolute garbage before the weekend is over." Preston made good on his threat to destroy my reputation. By Friday morning, my phone was exploding with notifications and frantic text messages. Vanessa had booked an emergency guest spot on the Daily Truth broadcast. It was the most popular local podcast in the city, with hundreds of thousands of daily listeners who hung on every word of their investigative reporting. I watched the video feed from my laptop sitting at the marble island in my kitchen. Vanessa sat in front of the studio microphones wearing a modest gray sweater and minimal makeup to look as vulnerable and exhausted as possible. She cried exactly on cue, dabbing her eyes with a tissue while she told the host a completely fabricated story about our grandfather. She claimed that I had locked our dying grandfather in his room during his final days. She told the audience that I manipulated his medication and withheld his care to force him to sign away the family trust. She painted a vivid picture of me as a bitter, unstable woman who was purposely sabotaging community development in the South District just to punish my successful sister and her visionary husband. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and the host ate up every single second of her performance. The public backlash was instantaneous and severe. My urban planning firm started receiving boycott threats before the podcast episode even ended. My assistant called me in an absolute panic, saying that our top 3 commercial clients were demanding to pause their contracts pending an investigation into the elder abuse allegations. My social media accounts were flooded with thousands of hate messages from strangers calling me a monster and a thief and a disgrace to my community. Elias called me pacing his office floor and told me we needed to release a defensive legal statement immediately. He wanted to publish the certified medical records, the revoked power of attorney, and the forged surface deeds to clear my name and prove Preston was the real criminal. I told Elias no. Defending myself with paperwork would only give their lies more oxygen and make me look like I was scrambling for excuses. I did not want a defensive statement. I wanted total annihilation. I made a phone call to the executive producer of the Metro News Network. It was a massive statewide broadcast network with 10 times the reach of Vanessa's little podcast. I told the producer I was ready for an exclusive live interview to address the Vanguard Holdings controversy and the South District Development Project. They sent a camera crew and a seasoned anchor to my penthouse that same afternoon. They set up bright studio lights and heavy cameras right in the middle of my living room, with the Atlanta skyline framed perfectly behind me. The anchor sat across from me, looking eager for a dramatic, emotional confrontation. The moment we went live, the anchor leaned forward and asked me how I responded to my sister's devastating allegations of elder abuse and fraud. I did not answer the question. I did not defend my character or explain the complicated legal structure of the trust. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a small digital audio player. Before I humiliated Preston at the country club, I had instructed Elias to pull the security and audio feeds from the dining room where my family had been drinking. Preston had been wearing a hidden microphone for a promotional business video he was filming earlier that day. He was so incredibly arrogant, he had forgotten to turn it off when his camera crew took a break. I held the audio player up to the network microphone and pressed play. The entire state heard Preston's voice crisp and clear. He was bragging to his wealthy investors about the South District project. He laughed as he called the African American community living there a bunch of helpless roaches waiting to be stepped on. He boasted about bulldozing their generational businesses without giving them a single dime of relocation money. But the worst part was how he talked about my parents. Preston's recorded voice echoed through my living room and across the live broadcast. He called his own in-laws inferior pawns who were incredibly easy to herd. He laughed loudly as he told the investors that my father was so desperate for white validation that he would sell his own daughter for a country club membership. He called my mother a pathetic social climber who was too stupid to realize she was mortgaging her own house to pay for his offshore gambling debts. He said they were useful idiots who would gladly hand over their entire estate just to feel like they belonged to a world that secretly despised them. I turned the audio player off and looked directly into the camera lens. I told the anchor that my family was willing to destroy an entire community to protect a man who thought they were subhuman. The interview aired live across the state, and the podcast narrative was instantly destroyed. Preston was exposed not just as a financial fraud, but as a vile racist who despised the very people funding his lavish lifestyle. I thought that hearing the undeniable truth about Preston would finally wake my parents up. I thought they would hear the racial slurs and the absolute contempt he had for them, and finally cut ties. I thought the sheer humiliation of being called inferior pawns on live television would break the spell they were under. I was wrong. Less than an hour after the broadcast ended, my father pounded on the heavy double doors of my penthouse. I had told building security to let him up, because I wanted to look him in the eye. I opened the door and found my father standing in the foyer with my mother right behind him. Their faces were red and twisted with fury. They did not apologize for believing Vanessa. They did not express outrage at the horrible things Preston had said about them behind their backs. My father pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He blamed me for tearing the family apart. He screamed that I was deliberately airing dirty laundry and ruining their only chance to secure the $50 million bank loan. My mother pushed past him and told me I was an absolute monster for humiliating Vanessa's husband in public. She said that businessmen talk like that all the time, and I was taking his words out of context just to be vindictive and jealous. They were entirely blinded by the promise of $50 million and proximity to power. They would rather defend a man who called them pathetic pawns than admit their own daughter was right all along. They were willing to sacrifice their dignity, their community, and their own flesh and blood just to keep the illusion of wealth alive. The rot did not just stop with Preston. It went straight to the core of my own family. I stood in the foyer looking at the two people who raised me and realized they were completely lost. I did not yell back. I did not cry. I simply nodded and told them to get out of my home before I called the police. My father cursed at me one last time before turning around and dragging my mother back to the elevator. They chose their side, and now I was going to make sure they went down with the sinking ship. The weekend passed in a blur of media chaos and absolute silence from my family. The broadcast had done its job perfectly. Every local news channel and financial blog was playing the recording of Preston on a continuous loop. His racist, arrogant words echoed through the city, stripping away the polished veneer he had spent years cultivating. I knew my parents were locked inside their estate, refusing to answer calls from their former country club friends who were now distancing themselves from the scandal. I spent my time preparing for their next move. I knew my father, Harrison, would not simply retreat. He was a man who operated on pride and physical intimidation when his money failed him. He proved me right on Monday morning. I arrived at my urban planning firm just before 8. The firm was located in a restored brick building downtown, a place I had designed to feel open and collaborative. When I stepped off the elevator, the heavy glass doors to my lobby were completely shattered. Shards of safety glass covered the welcome mat. I walked through the ruined entrance and found my staff huddled near the conference room. Two massive men wearing dark tactical jackets were standing in the middle of my office. They were systematically pulling client files from the cabinets and throwing them across the hardwood floor. One of them was leaning over my receptionist, kicking her desk and telling her that the firm was permanently closed. He said her boss needed to learn basic respect for her elders and drop her ridiculous claims against the family. It was such a cowardly and desperate tactic. My father had hired cheap muscle to terrorize innocent people because he lacked the courage to face me himself. He thought I would panic and call him begging for peace. He thought I was still the fragile daughter he could easily bully into submission. I did not panic. I did not even raise my voice. I simply stepped to the side and let Elias walk past me. Elias had accompanied me to the office, anticipating exactly this kind of retaliation. The two thugs turned around and puffed out their chests, preparing to intimidate us. They did not even have a chance to throw a punch. Elias moved with a terrifying silent efficiency. He grabbed the first man by his tactical jacket and slammed him face first into the heavy oak reception desk. The second man lunged forward, but Elias swept his leg and pinned him to the floor with a knee pressed hard against his spine. It took less than 10 seconds. The office was dead silent except for the groans of the two men struggling to breathe. Elias reached into the pocket of the man on the floor and pulled out a ringing cell phone. The caller ID flashed Harrison Wilson. Elias answered the phone and put it on speaker, setting it on the desk. My father's angry voice immediately filled the lobby. He demanded to know if the office was destroyed and if I was crying yet. I leaned down close to the phone. I kept my tone deadpan and completely devoid of emotion. I told my father that his messengers were currently bleeding on my floor. I told him he was a pathetic old man who sent amateurs to fight a war he had already lost. I promised him that if he ever sent someone to threaten my staff again, I would have Elias pay a personal visit to his suburban estate. My father stammered, trying to formulate a threat, but I ended the call. Elias dragged the two men to their feet and shoved them into the service elevator, warning them never to return. I spent the next hour calming my staff. I told them I would double their salaries for the month and grant paid leave to anyone who needed it. I hired a private security detail to stand guard at the building entrance. I wanted to show my team what actual leadership looked like. I was not going to let my father win by disrupting the business I had built from nothing. While my father was throwing a childish tantrum, Preston was fighting for his very survival. The $50 million loan from Sterling National Bank was permanently frozen, and Richard Vance had banned Preston from ever entering the building again. The offshore creditors Preston owed were no longer sending polite emails. They were demanding immediate payment. Preston was drowning. His public reputation was toxic, and his professional network had completely abandoned him. No legitimate bank in the country would touch Apex Development after hearing the recording of him calling investors inferior pawns. But Preston still needed that $50 million by the end of the week, or he would face federal indictments and personal bankruptcy. When an arrogant man becomes desperate, he stops looking for smart solutions and starts looking for fast ones. I knew Preston would seek out shadow lenders. He would look for underground equity firms that did not care about public scandals or racist remarks, as long as they could charge exorbitant interest rates and secure heavy collateral. Late that afternoon, I sat in my private office reviewing the security upgrades for the building. Elias walked in and placed a sleek black tablet on my desk. He did not say a word. He just tapped the screen, and a live surveillance feed appeared. The camera was hidden in the corner of a dimly lit boardroom in an unmarked industrial building on the edge of the city. Preston was sitting at a metal table. He looked absolutely wretched. His designer suit was wrinkled and his hair was unkempt. He was sweating profusely and his hands were shaking as he gripped a pen. I watched in silence as Preston signed page after page of a massive legal contract. He was securing a high-risk $50 million bridge loan. To get the money, he was pledging his own personal assets. He was signing over the deeds to his primary mansion, his luxury cars, and the remaining shell companies he controlled. He was agreeing to interest rates that were essentially predatory and signing clauses that allowed immediate seizure of assets upon a single missed payment. He thought he was outsmarting me by finding a backdoor to the cash he desperately needed. I smiled as I looked at my computer monitor. It was a cold, calculating smile. What Preston did not realize was that the anonymous underground lending firm he was borrowing from was a ghost subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings. The entire shadow operation was managed directly by Elias Thorne. We had set the bait days ago, knowing Preston would eventually panic and look for a lifeline in the dark. He was signing away the last fragments of his life to the very woman he was trying to destroy. Preston just walked willingly into my cage, and the lock was about to click shut permanently. The lock on Preston's financial cage had clicked shut, but my family was not done fighting. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals are always the most dangerous. The very next morning, Elias was finalizing the asset seizure protocols when my office phone rang. It was the security desk in the lobby of my firm. They told me my sister Vanessa was downstairs demanding to see me. She told the guards it was a matter of life and death, and that if I did not let her up, she would go directly to the press with incredibly damaging medical evidence. I told security to send her up to my private office. I wanted to see exactly what kind of desperate poison she had manufactured this time to try and save her sinking ship. Vanessa walked into my office a few minutes later looking entirely too smug for a woman whose husband had just mortgaged his entire life to a shadow lender. She was wearing a pristine white designer suit and carrying a thick yellow manila folder. She did not yell or throw a tantrum like my father had done the day before. She simply walked over to my heavy oak desk and dropped the folder right in front of me. I looked down at the dull yellow paper and then up at her. She had a cold, victorious smile plastered across her face. "I think it is time we had a real sisterly chat, Harper," she said, pulling up a chair and crossing her legs. "You have been playing a very dangerous game, and you have caused a lot of unnecessary stress for Mom and Dad. But it is over now. I am giving you one chance to surrender the South District Land Trust and step down from Vanguard Holdings before I destroy the rest of your life." I asked her what she thought she was doing. I told her Preston was already ruined and she had absolutely no leverage left. Vanessa just laughed, a sharp, high-pitched sound that grated against my ears. She leaned forward and tapped the yellow folder with her perfectly manicured fingernail. "Open it," she ordered. "Let us take a little walk down memory lane." I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of pages of highly confidential psychiatric evaluations and therapy notes from 10 years ago. They were the medical records from the absolute darkest period of my life. When I was 22 years old, the emotional abuse from our parents and the constant gaslighting from Vanessa had completely broken my spirit. I had suffered from severe clinical depression and crippling anxiety attacks. I had spent weeks in a private inpatient facility, just trying to find the will to live. It was a deeply painful private struggle that I had fought incredibly hard to overcome. And now my sister had somehow bribed or blackmailed someone to dig up those sealed medical records just to use them as a weapon against me. I stared at the pages, my heart pounding heavily in my chest. Vanessa watched my reaction with absolute delight. She was enjoying every single second of my discomfort. "It was incredibly expensive to get my hands on those," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But it was worth every single penny." "My legal team has reviewed everything, Harper. These records prove that you have a documented history of severe mental instability. You were hospitalized. You were heavily medicated. You were completely incapable of caring for yourself, and you were a danger to your own well-being." I looked at her, keeping my voice steady. That was 10 years ago, Vanessa, I said. I was depressed because of how this toxic family treated me. It has absolutely nothing to do with my ability to manage a financial trust today. Vanessa smiled, leaning back in her leather chair. A judge is not going to see it that way, she said smoothly. A judge is going to see a fragile, unstable young woman who somehow manipulated a dying old man into giving her control of $1 billion real estate empire. My lawyers are prepared to file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. We are going to present these medical records in open court and request a full competency hearing. We are going to argue that you are mentally unfit to manage Vanguard Holdings or make any financial decisions for yourself. She paused, letting the terrible threat hang heavy in the quiet office. Once the judge declares you incompetent, the court will appoint a legal conservator, she continued. And since Mom and Dad are your next of kin, they will be granted full control of your estate. They will hand the South District land right back to Preston. Everything you built and everything you think you stole from us will be gone. You will be locked away in some quiet little facility for your own good, and we will never have to deal with your pathetic jealousy ever again. I stared at the medical records and then back at my sister. The sheer villainy of what she was doing was breathtaking. She was weaponizing my past trauma just to steal money. She was threatening to strip away my basic human rights and have me declared legally insane, all because she wanted to fund her luxury vacations and save her racist husband from bankruptcy. It was the most vile form of blackmail imaginable. My mind raced through the implications. If she filed that injunction, it would tie up the Vanguard assets in a messy public legal battle for months or even years. The press would have a field day with my medical history. I needed her to hold off. I needed her to wait just long enough for Elias to finalize the default protocols on Preston's shadow loan. I needed exactly 3 days to spring the ultimate trap and destroy them completely. So I gave Vanessa exactly what she came for. I gave her the broken, fragile sister she desperately wanted to see. I let my hands start to tremble over the open folder. I took a shaky breath and let a single tear spill over my eyelashes. I looked away from her, staring down at the desk, as if the weight of the threat had completely crushed my spirit. "Please do not do this, Vanessa," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please, you know those records will ruin me. If you take this to a judge, they will lock me up again. I cannot go back to a facility. Please, I am begging you." Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. She was practically vibrating with excitement at the sight of my tears. "Then sign the land over," she demanded. "Sign the South District deeds over to Apex Development and step down from the board today." I let out a loud sob and covered my face with my hands. "I cannot just sign it right this second," I cried, my voice muffled and frantic. "There are strict corporate protocols. Elias has to prepare the transfer documents and clear the banking holds. It takes time. Please, Vanessa, give me 3 days. Just give me 72 hours to get the paperwork drafted, and I will give you everything. I will sign it all away. Just promise me you will not file those medical records." Vanessa stood up, smoothing the front of her pristine white suit. She looked down at me like I was an insect she had just stepped on. "You have exactly 3 days, Harper," she said, her voice laced with supreme arrogance. "Have the transfer documents ready by Friday morning. If you try to pull anything, or if you miss the deadline by a single minute, my lawyers will file the competency petition before lunch, and you will spend the rest of your life in a padded room." She turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors of my office. She did not look back. She just walked out, gloating in her total victory, convinced she had finally put me back in my place. I listened to the clanking of her heels fade away down the hallway. The moment the elevator doors chimed shut, my tears instantly stopped. My hands stopped shaking. I wiped my cheek and calmly closed the yellow manila folder. I looked at Elias, who had been standing silently in the shadows of the adjoining conference room the entire time. He walked out and stood beside my desk. "She took the bait," I said, my voice completely clear and cold. Elias nodded, checking his encrypted tablet. 72 hours is more than enough time," he said. "Preston's first payment on the shadow loan is due on Thursday night. When he defaults, we seize everything he owns before the sun comes up." I smiled. Vanessa thought she was destroying my life with those stolen medical records. She had no idea she had just bought me the exact amount of time I needed to watch her husband lose absolutely everything. The moment the heavy glass doors closed behind my sister, my tears instantly stopped. My hand stopped shaking and I wiped my cheek, calmly closing the yellow manila folder that she had left on my desk. Vanessa walked away, gloating over her perceived victory, completely unaware that her blackmail attempt was the final piece of evidence I needed. I looked over at Elias, who had been standing silently in the shadows of the adjoining conference room the entire time. I told him that she took the bait and that we now had exactly 3 days to spring the trap. As soon as Vanessa left the building, Elias and I got to work. I did not spend my time crying or drafting the transfer deeds that my sister had demanded. Instead, I handed Elias the manila folder containing my medical history and told him to find out exactly who authorized the release of those highly classified psychiatric files. It took Elias less than 2 hours to trace the digital footprint back to a man named Dr. Gregory Hale. He was the chief of psychiatry at the Oakwood Medical Center, which was a private boutique clinic located just outside the city limits. Dr. Hale was a prominent figure in the local medical community, and he had a reputation for catering exclusively to the wealthy elite. I did not just want to sue Dr. Hale for a medical privacy violation. I wanted to own the ground he walked on. I authorized Vanguard Holdings to initiate a hostile corporate takeover of the Oakwood Medical Center. Money moves incredibly fast when you have billions of dollars in liquid assets, and by Wednesday morning, my holding company had successfully acquired the entire medical group. I was suddenly the primary stakeholder of the clinic, and I demanded a full forensic audit of their internal communication servers and financial ledgers. What my auditors found buried in Dr. Hale's encrypted private files was more damning than I could have ever imagined. Dr. Hale did not just leak my 10-year-old medical records to my sister out of the goodness of his heart. My auditors uncovered a massive paper trail of offshore wire transfers linking Dr. Hale directly to Apex Development. Preston and Vanessa had paid him nearly $500,000 over the past 5 years. I sat in my office reading the audit report as the true scope of their conspiracy finally came into focus. Dr. Hale was the exact same physician who had signed the fake medical clearances declaring my grandfather legally incapacitated. Preston and Vanessa had bribed him to forge the medical power of attorney they used to steal the South District land in the first place. Dr. Hale was the absolute linchpin of their entire fraudulent real estate empire, and now because Vanessa had gotten greedy and used him to pull my old psychiatric files, she had led me right to the smoking gun. I had Elias summon Dr. Hale to my penthouse late Wednesday afternoon. The doctor walked into my living room looking confused and slightly annoyed. He was wearing an expensive tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase, clearly expecting to meet a wealthy new client. He did not recognize me at first. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city skyline before turning to face him. I tossed the yellow manila folder onto the coffee table right next to the thick stack of forensic audit reports. I watched the color completely drain from his face as he realized who I was and what was sitting on the table. I did not raise my voice. I simply told Dr. Hale that as the new majority owner of the Oakwood Medical Center, I was terminating his employment, effective immediately. I told him that I had already forwarded his offshore bank records and the forged medical power of attorney to federal authorities and the state medical board. Dr. Hale started to panic. He fell to his knees on my expensive rug, begging me to reconsider. He blamed Preston for everything, claiming he was pressured and manipulated into signing the fake documents. He promised to testify against my sister and her husband if I just let him keep his medical license. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold contempt. I told him he should have thought about his medical license before he sold a dying old man to a real estate scammer and leaked a young woman's private trauma for cash. I had my private security drag him out of the penthouse sobbing and ruined. With the doctor completely neutralized, Vanessa's blackmail material was suddenly worthless. Any judge would throw out my psychiatric records the moment they realized the doctor who provided them was facing federal prison for medical fraud and bribery. My sister had tried to back me into a corner, but she had only managed to hand me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. I did not call Vanessa to tell her she had lost. I let the federal government deliver the message for me. On Thursday morning, Elias arranged for a team of federal agents to pay a visit to Vanessa's suburban mansion. I watched the live security feed from a drone Elias had positioned over her neighborhood. The agents knocked on her grand front door and served her with a federal subpoena for conspiracy to commit extortion and medical fraud. I watched through the camera feed as my sister snatched the heavy envelope from the agent. Her perfect morning routine completely shattered. I expected her to panic. I expected her to call me sobbing and begging for mercy just like Dr. Hale had done. But the arrogance of my family runs deeper than simple logic. Less than an hour after the federal agents left her property, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message from Vanessa. The message did not ask for forgiveness. It did not mention the subpoena or the fact that she was facing serious federal charges. She was completely delusional. Her text simply read that I was pathetic for trying to scare her with fake legal threats. She wrote that tomorrow morning was the official public groundbreaking ceremony for the South District Mega Mall, and the entire city was going to be there. She arrogantly declared that once the media broadcasted the groundbreaking, the bank would be forced to unfreeze the $50 million loan to avoid a public relations disaster. She told me to bring the signed land trust documents to the ceremony tomorrow morning, or she would ruin me in front of the press. I read her message twice, just to marvel at the sheer magnitude of her denial. She honestly believed that a public party and a few golden shovels could stop the absolute hurricane that was about to hit them. She thought the groundbreaking ceremony was going to be her ultimate triumph. She had no idea that tomorrow morning her husband was going to default on his shadow loan, and Elias was going to seize every single asset they owned right in front of the local news cameras. Friday morning arrived with the kind of bright, crisp sunshine that felt entirely inappropriate for a funeral, but that was exactly what Preston had organized without even realizing it. The South District construction site had been transformed overnight from a dusty, abandoned lot into a sickening spectacle of corporate vanity. Preston had spared absolutely no expense for his moment of ultimate triumph. A massive white tent had been erected over the main staging area, complete with catered breakfast buffets, crystal chandeliers hanging from the temporary metal rafters, and a pristine red carpet rolled directly over the packed dirt. A grand wooden stage sat at the very center, flanked by towering speakers and bright spotlights. Behind the stage, a fleet of heavy yellow bulldozers and excavators were lined up like mechanical soldiers. Their diesel engines were already idling, rumbling with a low, heavy vibration that shook the ground beneath our feet. They were waiting for the signal to tear into the first block of generational family businesses the very moment the ribbon was cut. The turnout was massive. Every local news station had sent a camera crew, and the press bleachers were packed with reporters eager to cover the highly controversial South District Megamall project. The mayor was there shaking hands and posing for photographs, completely oblivious to the fraudulent foundation the entire project was built upon. He was just happy to be attached to a high-profile development. My family was treating the event like a royal coronation. My father stood near the front row wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, puffing his chest out and eagerly accepting congratulations from the remaining investors who had not completely abandoned them after the radio broadcast. My mother was draped in designer silk, smiling brightly for the cameras and playing the role of the proud matriarch who had weathered the storm of a rebellious daughter. But it was Vanessa and Preston who truly stole the show. They looked like absolute caricatures of wealth and untouchable arrogance. Vanessa wore an emerald green gown that looked like it belonged on a red carpet rather than a dusty construction site. She kept glancing toward the street entrance, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. She was waiting for me. She fully expected me to walk through the crowd, broken and humiliated, clutching the signed land trust documents, just as she had demanded in my office. She actually thought her vile blackmail had worked, and she was eager to watch me surrender in front of the entire city. Preston stepped up to the podium and the crowd quieted down. He looked out over the audience with a look of supreme, unbothered confidence. He leaned into the microphone and began delivering a sickeningly sweet speech about urban renewal and community revitalization. He talked about breathing new life into a dying district and creating a legacy of prosperity for the city. He did not mention the families he was violently displacing or the generational wealth he was actively destroying. He painted himself as a visionary savior who was rescuing the neighborhood from its own decay. To punctuate his grand speech, two of his assistants walked onto the stage carrying a massive novelty check. The amount written across the front in bold black ink was $50 million. The crowd erupted into polite applause as Preston held the giant check up for the news cameras. He proudly announced that despite the baseless and jealous attacks on his character, his firm had secured full funding from a private equity partner to guarantee the completion of the project. He was literally bragging about the shadow loan that had already sealed his fate. He had absolutely no idea that the midnight deadline had passed, and he was already in total catastrophic default. He thanked his beautiful wife and his loyal in-laws for standing by his side through the recent turbulence. He looked directly into the news cameras and declared that today marked the absolute end of the meaningless opposition against Apex development. The mayor stepped forward, handing Preston and Vanessa a pair of giant golden scissors. My parents moved onto the stage, standing proudly behind them for the final photo opportunity. A thick red ribbon had been stretched across the front of the stage, gleaming under the spotlights. Preston raised his hand, signaling the construction foreman behind the stage. The heavy bulldozers revved their massive engines, drowning out the applause of the crowd. Thick black exhaust smoke plumed into the clear morning air as the steel tracks prepared to move forward. Vanessa gripped the golden scissors, her eyes scanning the crowd one last time for my defeated arrival. Preston smiled for the flashing cameras, fully ready to cut the ribbon and officially claim the land he had stolen. The scissors never touched the ribbon. The deep roar of the bulldozers was suddenly overshadowed by the aggressive screeching of heavy tires turning onto the gravel. 5 massive black bulletproof SUVs turned sharply off the main avenue and drove straight onto the active construction site. They did not slow down for the parking attendants, and they did not stop at the designated drop-off zone. They drove with terrifying aggressive precision straight through the velvet ropes and catering tables, sending terrified guests and security guards scattering out of the way. The convoy kicked up massive thick clouds of dust as they accelerated toward the stage. They moved in perfect synchronized formation, cutting a path directly across the pristine red carpet. Preston dropped the giant golden scissors, and the mayor stumbled backward in absolute shock as the vehicles swerved sharply and slammed their brakes. The 5 black SUVs formed a solid, impenetrable steel barricade directly between the grand stage and the revving bulldozers. The dust washed over the crowd, and the entire site went dead silent, except for the low, idling engines of the tactical vehicles. Vanessa clutched Preston's arm, her smug smile entirely gone, replaced by wide-eyed panic. My father pushed his way to the front of the stage, his face turning purple with rage at the sudden interruption. They stood there frozen, staring at the tinted black windows of the SUVs, completely unaware that their luxurious world had just ended. The doors of the lead black SUV opened simultaneously, and I stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. I was wearing a tailored black suit that contrasted perfectly with the ridiculous emerald green ball gown my sister had chosen for her supposed victory lap. Elias Thorne stepped out of the vehicle right behind me, flanked by 4 massive federal marshals wearing dark tactical vests. The crowd of reporters and local politicians parted like the Red Sea as we marched directly down the pristine red carpet toward the grand wooden stage. The flashing cameras of the local press immediately pivoted away from Preston and locked onto me. My mother shrieked into the microphone, completely forgetting her elegant socialite persona. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at me to get off the property immediately. She told the confused crowd that I was a disturbed and jealous woman who simply wanted to ruin a historic moment for our community. My father rushed forward, his face twisted with absolute fury. He tried to physically block the stairs leading up to the stage, but two federal marshals stepped effortlessly in front of him. They pushed their hands against his chest, forcing him to stumble backward into a catering table covered in crystal champagne flutes. Preston tried desperately to maintain the role of the confident visionary developer. He held up his forged surface deed, waving it for the news cameras like a shield against the truth. He grabbed the microphone and announced that I was a disgruntled former trustee who had been legally removed for severe mental incompetence. He told the press that security would handle this minor interruption and that the heavy bulldozers would commence clearing the lot in exactly 5 minutes. I did not say a single word to him. I simply walked up the wooden stairs and crossed the stage until I was standing inches away from his arrogant face. I reached inside my suit jacket and pulled out the original ironclad land trust documents. The papers were bound in heavy blue leather and stamped with the official state seal. I slapped the thick binder directly against Preston's chest, hitting him so hard he gasped and dropped his forged papers onto the wooden floorboards. The lead federal marshal stepped up to the wooden podium and pulled out a thick stack of federal warrants. His voice boomed across the silent construction site, commanding absolute authority. He officially announced a federal cease and desist order, freezing all construction and seizing the entire property as an active crime scene. The marshal turned toward the line of idling bulldozers and ordered the foreman to shut down the diesel engines immediately. The heavy mechanical rumble slowly died away, leaving the massive white tent in absolute dead silence. My parents stood frozen in horror as they watched heavily armed federal agents physically secure the perimeter of their precious mega mall project right on live television. Preston broke out in a cold sweat. The confident visionary mask completely melted away to reveal the terrified coward underneath. He looked at the federal marshals blocking the stairs, and then looked at the secured perimeter, realizing he was completely trapped. He took a slow, careful step backward, hiding his body behind the large wooden podium. I watched his eyes dart nervously around the tent as he subtly slid his shaking hand into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out his cell phone. His fingers were trembling violently as he tapped the screen trying to open a secure banking application. He was frantically attempting to wire the $50 million from the shadow loan directly into his offshore accounts so he could flee the country before the marshals put him in federal handcuffs. He thought no one was watching him, but I saw every single pathetic movement. I walked over to the mayor, who was standing frozen in shock near the giant novelty check. I reached out and snatched the microphone right out of his trembling hands. I turned to face the crowd of reporters, wealthy investors, and community members. I did not just want to prove that the surface deed was a fake. I wanted to deliver the ultimate kill shot. I wanted to completely obliterate the toxic white savior complex my family worshipped so deeply. I raised the microphone and told the entire city that the man standing behind the podium was not a visionary developer, but a desperate common thief. I looked at Elias and gave him a single nod. Elias tapped the screen of his encrypted tablet. The massive digital jumbotrons that flanked the grand stage were supposed to display pristine three-dimensional renderings of the new shopping center. Instead, the bright screens flickered and suddenly projected a series of highly classified banking statements for everyone in the crowd to see. The $50 million shadow loan that Preston had just bragged about securing was completely gone. The project escrow accounts were entirely empty. The crowd gasped loudly as they looked up at the glowing screens. I narrated the financial trail for the press, explaining every single dirty transaction clearly into the microphone. Preston had been actively funneling the loan money out of the corporate accounts and routing it through a complex web of shell companies straight into a personal account hidden in the Cayman Islands. The local news cameras zoomed in on the projected bank transfers, capturing every detail of his massive financial crimes. I turned to look directly at my parents, who were standing near the edge of the stage, holding on to each other in absolute terror. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing off the surrounding brick buildings. I told my parents that their perfect white son-in-law never actually planned to build a single thing on this sacred community land. His master plan from the very beginning was to secure the massive loan drain, the accounts of every last penny, and flee the country by midnight tonight. But the most sickening part of his plan was his exit strategy. The jumbotrons shifted to display a series of leaked text messages and private flight manifests. Preston had booked 2 one-way first-class tickets to the Grand Cayman Islands for himself and his 24-year-old white secretary. I watched my mother's knees literally buckle as she read the explicit text messages on the giant screen. Preston had deliberately structured all the fraudulent deeds and fake holding companies directly under my parents' names. He was going to disappear to a tropical island with his young mistress and his stolen millions. His ultimate plan was to leave his loyal, obedient black-in-laws holding the bag to take the absolute fall for federal wire fraud and massive corporate forgery. He had carefully set them up to spend the rest of their lives rotting in federal prison, while he lived like a king on their stolen generational wealth. My father let out a guttural cry of absolute anguish as the reality of his misplaced loyalty finally shattered his mind. He had sold his own flesh and blood out to protect a man who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable legal shield. Vanessa dropped to the floor of the stage, sobbing uncontrollably, as she realized her perfect marriage was just a tool to steal her family's money. The silence on the stage was deafening as Preston dropped his cell phone and stared blankly at the glowing screens, knowing his life was officially over. The heavy silence did not last long. The absolute shock that had paralyzed my sister suddenly mutated into pure primal rage. Vanessa let out a sound that I had never heard before, a raw, terrifying shriek that tore from the bottom of her throat. She scrambled off the wooden floorboards and lunged directly at Preston. Her perfectly manicured nails became weapons as she slashed wildly at his face, tearing deep, bloody scratches across his cheek and neck. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could do this to her, how he could plan to leave her bankrupt and facing federal prison while he sipped cocktails on a beach with a 24-year-old secretary. Preston stumbled backward, raising his hands to protect his bleeding face, but he was too stunned by the absolute collapse of his empire to even fight back. The federal marshals did not immediately intervene. They simply watched for a few highly satisfying seconds before stepping forward and ripping Vanessa away from him. 2 agents shoved Preston face first onto the grand wooden podium, pulling his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing over the sound system was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. An agent read him his Miranda rights, while Preston squeezed his eyes shut, his arrogant face pressed against the cold wood. My parents watched the scene unfolding with absolute horror. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. They had been so blinded by their own greed and their desperate need for elite social status that they had eagerly sold their souls to a predator. Preston had specifically chosen them because he knew exactly how the system worked. He knew that when the forensic accountants eventually found the forged deeds and the missing $50 million, the authorities would be looking for someone to blame. And Preston had perfectly framed his black-in-laws to take the fall. He had exploited their race, their ambition, and their blind trust, setting them up to be the perfect scapegoats for his massive financial crimes while he vanished into the sunset with his white mistress. My father fell to his knees, his expensive tailored suit sinking into the dust of the construction site. My mother collapsed right beside him, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. The federal agents were securing the perimeter, pulling yellow crime scene tape across the staging area, and preparing to escort my family to the waiting tactical vehicles for intense interrogation. My parents looked up at me, their eyes wide with absolute terror. They began to literally crawl across the stage toward me, ignoring the splintering wood and the dust ruining their designer clothes. My father reached out with shaking hands, grasping at the hem of my suit pants. He begged me to help them. He pleaded with me to use my wealth and my lawyers to save them from federal prison. My mother sobbed openly, reaching for my hand, crying that they were so sorry and begging for mercy because we were family. She choked out the words, "We are blood, Harper. Please, you have to save us." I looked down at the two people who had raised me, who had spent my entire life making me feel small, invisible, and worthless. I felt absolutely no pity. My heart was completely steady as I took a deliberate step backward, forcing my father's hands to fall away into the dirt. I stared down into their terrified eyes, and my voice was cold and hollow. I told them that blood does not use their own daughter as a sacrificial lamb to fund a fraudulent empire. I told them that blood does not throw their child away just to impress a parasite. I looked at the federal agents closing in behind them, and then I looked back at my parents. "You chose this grave," I whispered, so the microphones would not catch it. "Now lie in it." It took exactly 1 year for the dust to fully settle and for the justice system to grind my family into the dirt where they belonged. Exactly 12 months after that chaotic morning, the world looked entirely different. Preston did not get his tropical getaway or his beautiful young secretary. Instead, he received a massive federal sentence. The judge did not show him an ounce of leniency, sentencing him to 20 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. There were no country club prisons for him. He was stripped of his wealth, his tailored suits, and his arrogant smirk completely buried behind concrete walls. Vanessa barely managed to avoid a prison cell herself, mostly because her lawyers proved she was too ignorant of the actual financial mechanics to be the mastermind. But she did not escape punishment. She was slapped with severe felony probation and completely stripped of every single asset she had ever touched. Her designer wardrobe, her jewelry, her cars, and her suburban mansion were all seized and liquidated by the federal government. Today, my sister, who once thought she was royalty, works the night shift at a local diner, sweeping floors and wiping down greasy tables just to pay off the massive mountain of bankruptcy debts she was left with. My parents met a similarly devastating fate. Corinne and Harrison were utterly disgraced. The society friends they had fought so desperately to impress abandoned them overnight the moment the scandal hit the local news. Their sprawling estate was seized to pay back the defrauded investors. Today, they live in a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. They do not host elegant dinner parties or brag about their powerful connections anymore. They spend their days sitting in absolute silence, staring at the peeling wallpaper. They try to call me every single day. They leave long, rambling voicemails begging for a second chance, pleading for financial help, or just a moment of my time. They have no idea that I changed my personal phone number 10 months ago. Their desperate pleas go to a disconnected line floating completely unheard in the digital void. I cut them off completely, erasing their toxicity from my life forever. While their empire crumbled to ashes, I spent the year building something real. The sun was shining brightly as I stood on the exact same piece of property in the South District. But the view was entirely transformed. There was no ugly mega mall, and there were no predatory bulldozers waiting to tear down the community. Instead, I stood in front of a beautiful modern facility featuring wide glass windows, bright open workspaces, and lush green landscaping. I was holding a pair of giant ceremonial scissors, but this time they were not a prop for a greedy scam. The crowd in front of me was not filled with corrupt politicians or wealthy investors. It was filled with local families, small business owners, and hopeful young faces. I squeezed the handles and cut the thick blue ribbon officially opening the Theodore Legacy Center. I had used my own capital to develop my grandfather's land exactly as he would have wanted. It was now a state-of-the-art business incubator and affordable housing center, specifically designed for young African-American entrepreneurs. The facility provided free office space, mentorship programs, and direct funding for minority-owned businesses, helping them build the exact kind of generational wealth that Preston had tried to destroy. The crowd erupted into genuine joyful applause as the ribbon fell away. I smiled, stepping back from the podium and looking up at the clear blue sky. I knew my grandfather was watching, and I knew he was proud. I had protected our soil and turned his dream into a permanent reality. I looked around at the vibrant, thriving community gathering in the courtyard, and I realized the absolute truth about power. True legacy is not built on forged signatures, stolen land, or the desperate need to impress toxic people. True legacy is built on the unbreakable power of the underestimated rising from the ashes of betrayal to become the kings and queens of their own destiny. The greatest lesson this story teaches us is that toxic loyalty will always lead to your own destruction. Valuing status over those who truly love you builds a castle on lies. My family was so blinded by their greed and their desperate need to be accepted by a predator that they willingly sacrificed their flesh and blood. They learned the hard way that the truth always comes to the light, and that karma is a relentless force that cannot be outrun by empty wealth. True power belongs to those who stand firmly in their authenticity and refuse to be victimized. If you have ever had to stand up against toxic family members to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more content.